Today. The title of this message is Pray and Be Patient. Pray and be patient. Jesus told his apostles to pray for the harvest because the workers are few. Now, from that statement, we can assume that prayer makes a difference. Because why would he say pray for the harvest? The workers are few if nothing could be changed. And chapter 5 of the book of James, James talks about Elijah. He says he was a man just like we're men and women. And as part of his warning to the northern 10 tribes of Israel, he prayed that it wouldn't rain. In other words, they'd have a drought. And they had a drought. God backed up that prayer. Now, that's the way it's written. And he says, a righteous man's fervent prayer is a powerful thing. That's what the book of James says. So prayer does make a difference. and prayer has power. Now the issue is, what do we do when God says no? Or when God says not now or not for a long time? Because we have to be honest, that does happen, right? God is in control. I know we all know that. We've said it many times, but sometimes I think what we have to do is stay hopeful, trust that God knows what he's doing. Carl and I were talking coming to church. And the old story, my teachers and they backed it up with facts, so they probably are correct. They said if the Roaring Twenties had roared all the way to 1941, the American character would not have been enough to win World War II. And they have all kinds of family dissolutions, and a lot of bad things happened during the Roaring Twenties. Prosperity can be bad for people, odd as that sounds. And the Great Depression toughened Americans up. I'm not saying it wasn't hard and cruel. So I'm not saying it was easy. Because some of you have parents like my grandparents and my parents, to a lesser extent, went through the Great Depression, and they said, you kids are spoiled. Anyway, they talked about how they worked on a farm and they made their own ice cream, at times even made their own candy. I mean, we probably laugh at all that now, but they were better off. They actually rented a farm. They're better off than a lot of people. They actually help feed other people. But the point I'm getting at is, sometimes God let hard times come even when people pray for relief, and you just don't know. Okay, everybody's praying about the election and keep doing it. I mean, we did all we could. We voted the right way. We prayed about it. So now we just, it's in God's hands. I want to consider something. I know we all know this, but I just want to read it. This is Daniel 4:17. Daniel 4:17. Just one of the prophecies and discussions that went in that time period. This decision is by decree of the watcher. This has to do with Nebuchadnezzar. He had an arrogant attitude. He thought he did it himself instead of God blessing him. So anyway, the sentence by the word of the Holy One, in order that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdoms of men, and he gives it to whomever he will, and sets over it the lowest of men. Some translations say the basest of men. Now, if you look at world history, you look at people like Pol Pot, Mao Zedong, Stalin, Hitler, you'd have to say, yeah, a lot of base men have gotten to high positions and abused their power. I mean, there's no way you could deny that truth. Genghis Khan, and there are probably a whole lot of base men we don't even know about in all kinds of places. God is in control. I, of course, can't answer the question of why God allows suffering. It is a tough question, and it's one that writers have kicked around for years, and we probably will not know the full answer till the kingdom comes. And then God can, tell us why he allowed it. What I do think is the devil is there causing his mischief, and sometimes he allows the devil to have some level of success. There are some stories in 2 Kings, I won't go through all the details, where God said to a group of spirit beings meeting who was going to be a lying spirit to lead Ahab. He was the bad king, he and Jezebel of the northern 10 tribes of Israel, to lead him into a war he shouldn't commit into a battle where it will get killed. And I'm assuming it was a demon. You can debate that, but probably was a demon. He said, I will be a lying spirit, and all of his prophets, he probably had 400 or so prophets and other key people, and I'll get them all to back up this horrible, and we'll lead him to disaster. And God said, do it. And you're going to say, well, why would God let the devil get away with something now and then? I don't have the answer. I'm just saying that sometimes, now obviously Ahab and Jezebel deserved it, so that maybe is part of the answer. But still you wonder, and of course we always argue, is God going to give America the government we deserve? We don't want that. Believe me, we don't want that. But I don't have the answer. I'm admitting it. I don't have the answer. But God is in control. Now, further, Daniel 4:29, after getting the warning, Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar, you should stop sinning. You should have more justice in the land, and a few other, what I call repentant activities. And maybe God, this prophecy against you won't come true. Well, 12 months passed by, and then guess what happened? Daniel 4:29. At the end of the 12 months, he was walking about the royal palace of Babylon. By the way, Babylon was one of the most glorious cities. It had walls so thick that a chariot with horses could turn around on the top of the wall. They were super high, super thick, and they had a river that ran through it with iron gates so no one could cut off their water supply. Well, that's what they thought at least. But they were considered impregnable. It was the greatest city. It was one of the wonders of the ancient world at one point. So he's looking at all this in the famous Hanging Gardens of Babylon. And the king spoke, saying, is not this great Babylon that I, Nebuchadnezzar, have built? You see the arrogance in there. For a royal dwelling by my mighty power, for the honor of my majesty. And you realize that he was told by Daniel that God allowed him to collect that power and to be ruler of the first world ruling empire. While the word was still in the king's mouth, a voice fell from heaven. King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you. And then he went crazy for 7 years. And that's an interesting story. Because Nebuchadnezzar forgot who was in control. God was in control, not him. Now he was maybe blessed and honored to be able to lead the golden empire of Babylon, the first great world ruling empire. But it was God who allowed him to amass that power. And God plays a long game. I'm not even sure I can fully understand it, because remember it says one day is like 1,000 years to God. A long game is, they say China plays a long game too. You don't think of the immediate, like Americans always think of the immediate, what's going to happen this year, next month, next week, next day. I think God is playing a long game. And that means it's hard sometimes when you don't get an immediate answer, things don't go the way you want, to see the long game. I'm not saying I see the long game either. I'm just saying God plays a long game. And you can make all kinds of... Now I'm going to do wild speculation. What if God knows something really horrible is around the corner for the world in the next 1 or 2 or 3 years? He'd rather have certain people associated with it and other people not associated with it. I'm not saying that's true. And I don't know what the long game is going to be. Or he's preparing the way for Bible prophecy. If we're correct, America and Britain are not factors. America and Britain have been the big factors in world power for about the last, Britain last 500 years, and America about the last 150, 60 years. Actually, do you know America's been the #1 economy in the world since about 1871? This took the world a little while to fully realize it. But if we understand Bible prophecy, that's not going to be the case. It's going to be a Holy Roman Empire, United Europe, and some emperor, the King of the North, and something in the Middle East called the King of the South, and some Far Eastern powers that come in late. They're going to be the powers in the world, not America, not Britain. Now, we've always said that maybe if America repents, we can kind of be left out of some of the bad stuff coming at the end time. I guess we'll see. But America repenting fully does not seem to be on the horizon. I mean, just what it looks. But I'm not sure what the long game is. I really don't know. And nobody knows. Also, we have another problem. We can't see the spirit world. It's like, in the case of Job, I was going to mention this later in the sermon, but I'll mention it now because it fits. Job and his three friends were trying to figure out why Job was suffering, and he was a good man, and they debated back and forth, and it's a tiring debate. But the one thing is clear, they didn't know what was going on. It was God with a challenge to Satan, and it was the spirit world is why it all happened. It had nothing to do with Job, actually. Well, Job passed the first test. He said God gives and God takes away. So Job did the right thing. But after that, it really wasn't so much about Job, at least in one sense. It was a spirit war, but those men couldn't see it. Even Job couldn't see it. You can see Job's frustration, like, I'm doing all the right things. How is this happening to me? He couldn't see the spiritual battle. Now, in the end, God used Satan to make Job better. And you can see that at the very end. Job got twice as much wealth, and his daughters were the prettiest in the land. That most of you know the story. And he appreciated God better through his suffering. In other words, God used Satan long run to make Job a better Christian. But Job couldn't see that during all the mess, if that makes sense. He couldn't see the spiritual battle. I believe there is a spiritual battle going on. I'm not sure I understand it. And does it involve, say, archangels that stand for America versus Satan and his archangels? I'm not saying that's the case. I really don't know. We can kind of feel it and think it, but we can't see the spirit world. We have no clue. There could be a powerful angel sitting in the parking lot guarding us right now, but we can't see it, right? Hopefully inspiring us or whatever. So we don't know. All I'm saying is try to think in terms of the long game. When things go wrong, Satan wants you to get discouraged, give up. I know some young people that are sending me emails that seem that way. Well, if God is, God is messing up, or I'm not saying I can answer their question, but Satan wants you to get discouraged, give up on God. That's what we should not do, no matter how bad it gets. And it could get very bad. Carl and I discussed 4 or 5 bad scenarios that could possibly be coming off in the next year or two or month. Remember, God is in control. Keep praying. Keep believing, even during the dark days. I want to go through Winston Churchill's life. Because if you look at his life in total, you can tell God prepared him to save the world during the dark days of World War II. Everything in his background. I'm going to go through it kind of quickly. Most of you know this, but it's good to remind us. Churchill was bad in school, and he had problems with his father, who had a lot of problems, Lord Churchill. But he came from a high-ranking family. Duke of Marlborough is one of his descendants, and he wrote about him as well as his dad. Almost became prime minister, but that's a long, sad story. And his dad, they sent him to private schools where they beat him because he was not a good student. And some bad things happened. So he couldn't get in one of the elite colleges, so he had to go to their version of West Point and actually had to take the test 3 times to get in. And because of the low score, he got in the cavalry, which in those days, this is like 1880s and 90s, was the low end of the army. But that actually proved to his advantage. He was in the last great cavalry charge in Egypt in the war in the Middle East. He wrote a book called The River War about it. He was also in a battle in Afghanistan where he showed a lot of bravery. And then he went to South Africa and became a war hero. It really was dramatic. They were captured, and he went to a POW camp, and they had a plan to escape, and everybody chickened out the last minute, but Churchill went through it. Obviously, God blessed him when you read the story. But at that time, the British were losing the Boer War in South Africa. Everything was negative, except for one thing. Churchill had escaped. And it was all the British papers, the Boers put in their papers, we're tripling the reward for the capture or death of Churchill, dead or alive. And it got tons of publicity. And they kept doubling the ante to get Churchill. And somehow he escaped. And that's a great little story. And you can tell God blessed him. And he became a national hero. And it cheered up the British during the dark days of that war. They eventually did win that war, of course, but he used that fame to get into Parliament. In his late 20s, because of his book sales, he was the equivalent of a modern-day millionaire, war hero, and member of Parliament. And because he was a great speaker and had a tenacity and ambition that few people have, he rose fast in Parliament. World War I, he was First Lord of the Admiralty, which is a big deal in the British in World War I. And he came up with a plan for an amphibious invasion of Turkey, Gallipoli, you've probably heard of it. And they would take that, knock Turkey out of the war. They were one of the allies of the Germans, and reinforce the Russians who were faltering. And that was a big deal. Ultimately, the Russians did falter, and the Germans put all their forces on the Western Front, and the war got really mean. He was trying to do that, but it failed because he didn't have total control. They didn't plan for it right, and the people who administered it, they were just... I'll just give you one example. When the French and British Navy went in there, they knocked out the forts fairly quickly, but then a couple ships hit mines that were sunk, and they panicked. They didn't do anything. They withdrew. Well, if you're in a major military operation, you got to plan for that. You should have had minesweeper. That admiral in charge had never been in combat, and he quit. And obviously, the more they delayed, it gave the Germans time to pour troops and officers and artillery into Turkey. Well, it was a disaster. But you're going to say, what was the value of that? Well, what did Churchill learn from that? When it came to D-Day and the amphibious invasion of Europe, he made sure they had overwhelming force. I call it like in a medical operation. I remember Ben Carlson did this. He said, you got to have a backup to your backup. Assume that some things are going to go wrong, and then anyway, he described it very brilliantly. And he and Eisenhower worked hard on that. He didn't get his way on everything, but Eisenhower said he was a brilliant tactician. One thing you learn from failure, you got to be in control. By the way, one of the things that Churchill did when even the Americans wanted him to invade France first, the Americans tried a little bit. It was a disaster. They that didn't work so well. The Germans had too good a defense. He said, let's hit them in their soft underbelly in North Africa. And what it did was they found out which generals could fight, which admirals would follow through. And, they got people like Patton, and you probably know a lot of the stories. And they got the British General Montgomery. He found out who he could trust. In other words, it's like a training ground for the big game, which was the invasion of Europe and France. So can you see, and then the key thing was, during the 30s, Churchill got out of power. Some things went wrong. I'm going into all the details. But he started warning, as the only member of Parliament, this guy, Adolf Hitler, and the Nazis are dangerous. We're headed for another war, and Britain is not prepared. Britain and France were supposed to be the protectors of the Western world back then. America didn't join the League of Nations, so we're kind of on the sidelines. He says, we're not ready. Well, the papers accuse him of being a warmonger. The details may vary a little bit, but he was in the paper all the time saying that everybody was against him. He was out in the wilderness, no political power. He was out of the government. He was in Parliament, but out of all the cabinet spots, the way they do it in Britain. But then, when the German army defeated a French and British army which outnumbered them, in 5 weeks, the world was shocked. They'd taken Poland in 3 weeks. They'd taken, what looked like the lowlands in France and all of Western Europe in just a few weeks. The world was shocked. And it proved that Churchill was right. And then they took Norway and all that appeasement stuff. Like Churchill told Chamberlain, he says, you're going to appease Hitler. You think you're going to get peace. He says, you're not. You're going to lose honor and you're going to lose peace. You will get nothing. By then, the public realized Churchill was right, and the king put him in as prime minister. And even then, the British cabinet was going to make a treaty giving up some of their key possessions in the Mediterranean to the Nazis and to Mussolini for a peace, which would have pretty much guaranteed that Hitler would have won at least the first parts of World War I, World War II, which would have been a disaster to the world. Churchill went into the cabinet meeting, changed their mind. One man at a key moment, they call it the dark moment of World War II, he talked them out of it. He says, we will fight in the land. Anyway, the story is very brilliant. And Britain stood alone, but eventually Hitler screwed up and all is history. My point is, during the dark days and during the days when things looked bad for Churchill, God saw the long game and put him there to win World War II. That was the biggest event in the 20th century. Churchill saved the world. But he had a lot of times when he was out of power, heavily criticized, didn't do well in school. My only point is, we can now see the long game. We can see that all of Churchill's life prepared him for what he did. Does that make sense? And I'm not telling you all the story of Churchill's life. There are a lot more details that could add to what I just said. So we don't have any idea what God is doing or why. But keep the faith, even though it appears that evil is winning. I'm just saying that's how it looks. Evil is winning. God decides who rules, not king's talents. God decides who and when. Now I want to go to the case of Sarah. I'm estimating this, but Sarah had no child. And in those days, women having children was a big deal. I know today it's not a big deal, but it was a big deal then. And people were healthier longer. So probably when she was 40, she probably wasn't too worried about it. But I bet when she got to 50, and she was healthy because we knew how beautiful she was. So she was healthy. She said, well, how come I don't have a child? And she prayed to God. And I'm sure from age 50, I believe she had the child at age 90. I believe that's correct. That's what, 30, 40 years. Well, she lost faith at some point, and about 24 years into that period, she told her husband, well, I can have a child by my handmaid. I'll read the story. Genesis 16, 2 and 3. Genesis 16, 2 and 3. So Sarah said to Abraham, see now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go in to my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her. And Abraham heeded the voice of Sarah. Then Sarah, Abraham's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to Abraham to be his wife, after Abraham had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. She didn't wait for God. By the way, Ishmael became a problem in the camp when she later did have a son. And of course, the Arab nations come out of Ishmael, and they are a problem in the world to this very day, especially to Israel. The point I'm making is she probably had another 13 or 14 years to wait before God answered her prayer, but she should have waited. It would have been much better. And afterwards, when she kicked her handmaid out of the camp, I think she realized she made a mistake. She gave up on God. But I can understand it. You know, after 24 or 5 years of praying for a child and not getting one, I can see it. You know, we look at the mistakes of the people in the Bible. No, I would never make that mistake. I can understand it, can't you? And by the way, the one thing that you see in the Bible, when God wants to make a son a really, really, really special, the mother has to wait many, many years for him. You see that with Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel. And by the way, Isaac was when they almost sacrificed him at probably the same place where Christ was sacrificed. He played the role of Christ, and Abraham played the role of God the Father. But Isaac had to be super special to play that role. Does that make sense? And if you waited for a child till you were 90 years old, you think of how special that child would be? See, God was playing the long game, and almost all the patriarchs, including John the Baptist's mother, had to wait until their elderly years to have that child. I just see God's long game. We can't see it and understand it, but, well, now we can in those cases. We have to wait for God and not get too discouraged about the way things are going. And remember, in all the problems Job had, God was making Job better. And so I would just say, try not to get discouraged if evil seems to be winning. Remember, this is Satan's world, and sometimes it happens. Now, I have a funny story to tell you. This is a poem. Somebody sent me this poem. So remember, this is homemade poetry. The turkey shot out of the oven. The turkey shot out of the oven and rocketed into the air. It knocked every plate off the table and partly demolished the chair. It ricocheted into a corner and burst to a deafening boom, then splattered all over the kitchen, completely obscuring the room. It stuck to the walls and windows. It totally coated the floor. There was turkey attached to the ceiling, where there had never been turkey before. It blanketed every appliance. It smeared every saucer and bowl. There wasn't no way I could stop it. That turkey was out of control. I scraped and scrubbed with pleasure and thought with my chagrin as I mopped, I'd never again stuff a turkey with popcorn that hadn't been popped. Well, we may have some popping surprises awaiting us between now and the return of Christ. I have no idea. We've always said, it's arrogant to think we know it all, we're sure what's going to happen. Who knows? I mean, we know some things, don't get me wrong, and we'll probably know more as we get closer to the end. But I think there are going to be some surprises. I have no idea what the surprises may be. We don't know God's future. We did our part. We prayed and we voted the right way. That's about all you can do. It's in God's hands. I mean, keep praying. It could still be pulled out. Keep praying. And even after, if the bad people get in office, still keep praying anyway for America. Our prayers still have an effect. Acts 14:4. Acts 14:4. But the multitude of the city was divided. Part sided with the Jews and part with the apostles. And these are the Jews that had rejected Paul's message. Some Jews didn't, but a lot of them did. And they got mobs together. They can always find street thugs to get mobs. And we're going to see a lot of that in America in the future. There are plenty of street thugs. I think they enjoy looting. Give me another excuse to loot. I really think that's how they think. I'm sure they get them all emotionally upset too. And when a violent attempt was made by both the Gentiles and the Jews with their rulers to abuse and stone them, this is Paul and his party, they became aware of it and fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, that's a province in Asia Minor, and to the surrounding region. So they were forced out of Iconium, one city. Now this pattern that you see in the New Testament, you'll see that pattern over and over again. Paul goes to a place, usually stays about 6 months. The people who reject his message are bothered by his penetrating, slicing truth. In other words, why were the Jews so upset with Paul? Because he was saying the truth. Think about it. Out of their own Bible, he would say, look, you're wrong. Read this scripture. The truth actually bothers people more than if they could just laugh you off as some weirdo who's lying. And Paul and he also did miracles too. He says he wasn't a great speaker in the Greek rhetorical style, but whatever he was effective. He turned the world upside down. You'll see that in the book of Acts. He'd go from one town and they get all mad at him and they get a mob of thugs and they run him out of town. And he'd stay the next town 6 months, start a new congregation. And then the ones who were, and sometimes the pagans were afraid because people gave up their pagan stuff as well. That bothered them, the pagan guys too. They went after him as well. And the religious Jews who didn't want to convert. And he'd get run out, but as they moved him from city to city to city, guess what the long game was? Paul created more congregations, maybe faster than he would have without the persecution. So you look at the persecution and say, why did God allow it? Well, at least that's one reason. Then when he went to Jerusalem for his last witness to the Jewish people on his way to Rome, the way that actually worked out, it gave Paul a respite from the mobs. He spent several years in Roman custody, but in, kind of like a rented apartment. In Rome, he got his own house, but he was guarded by imperial soldiers. So he could invite, like he invited all the Jewish leaders in. You'll see that in the last chapter of the book of Acts. And he was able to give Christianity a good foundation in Rome because for over 2 years, people could come, hear Paul preach, and they couldn't touch him. He was guarded by the imperial army of Rome, and they wouldn't dare do anything to Paul. And then after he was acquitted after that and went back on a route. Some people think he went to Spain and then worked his way back to Asia Minor and reinforced the churches he started, and then moved back, further back into Europe. And eventually, the political forces arrested him a second time. He spent another 2 years in house arrest, and this time, at least secular history, there's no biblical history, says he was beheaded behind Caesar's throne. But secular history says, and the way Paul died was so magnificent, so courageous, and other martyrs in Rome at that time, that it actually converted more people. I know you're going to, why did God let a great man? Paul says he was older and he was ready to be sacrificed. He probably was of age where he couldn't do all that traveling. When you read Paul's works and you look at a map, he often is walking 20 miles in a day or two. Walking, not horseback riding. I was in the Army, we had to make a 20-mile forced march as part of our training. And we were young and had good Army boots. Do you know that is hard? I only did it once, I think once, and maybe a 10-mile once, a second. Man, that is hard. People in Paul's day did it on a regular basis. You'll see that, he's walking 20 miles here, almost 20. You think, whoa. I think people were physically tougher than we are today. We have cars and we're spoiled. We just don't know we're spoiled. But at any rate, the point is, when Paul was older, he couldn't do all that anymore. But through his letters and his writings and his martyrdom, he still boosted Christianity. So all the persecution against Paul actually benefited the gospel. And sometimes things go that way. It benefits the gospel. So sometimes God allows Satan to do things, and Satan thinks he's winning. But somehow, in the long, long run, it benefits the people of God. I'm not saying I know when, where, how, because it's going to be tricky to see any good coming out of evil that's going on in America right now. Acts 16, 7 and 9. After they had come to Mysia, they tried to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit did not permit them. We think maybe the people at the dock wouldn't let them get on the boat to go there, wouldn't let them get on the road or something. Then he had a vision appearing to Paul in the night, a man of Macedonia, that's across that Aegean Sea into Europe, stood and pleaded with him, saying, come over to Macedonia. And he went to Europe, and that's where all of his great letters were preserved, in Greece and Europe. And he did a lot of great work there. So even when he was prevented doing something, God turned it into a blessing. And the thing is, we have to wait for God and be positive. When things look dark, try not to get too discouraged. I know it's not happy to see evil win, but try not to get too discouraged. Stay positive. God is still in control. I have no idea what's going to happen and when we'll get to the point where we'll see, now I know why God allowed this bad things to happen. I'm not saying I know. And keep praying. Maybe things can turn around somehow. 1 Samuel 13, 8 through 12. This is Saul, and Saul had been told to wait for Samuel to do the official high priest prayer for success in battle, and Samuel told him he'd be there within 7 days. Well, they're getting close to the end of that period, and Saul got worried. So then he waited 7 days, according to the time set by Samuel. Saul did not come to Gilgal, and the people were starting to scatter. His army was losing courage in the face of those hostile Philistines. So Saul said, bring a burnt offering and peace offering here to me. And he offered a burnt offering. Just as he finished doing it, Samuel came. And Samuel told him, if you just waited a few more hours, I would have gotten there. God was testing you. One of the things God does not like is for someone to overstep their authority. You'll see this in the Bible in more than one place. The king was not to take over the role of the high priest. They just weren't supposed to do that. It's like there was secular government, and then there was the temple and the tabernacle on the spiritual side, and the king wasn't supposed to cross over. That was a real no-no with God. It's almost like Satan, who had a lot of power in the spiritual world, but he wanted to be like God. You getting, and he did not like that. And Samuel explains it to him that you can't do that. So Samuel goes on and says, now here's Saul talking to Samuel. Saul says, when I saw that the people were scattering from me, and that you did not come within the days appointed, actually he did, but he waited till about the last 2 or 3 hours, and the Philistines gathered together at Michmash, then I said, the Philistines will now come down on me at Gilgal, and I have not made the application of the Lord. So I felt forced or compelled to take over the role of high priest. Whenever Saul was confronted with his sin, unlike David, he made excuses. I saved the best of the stuff. The people pressured me to do it. The threat of the Philistines forced me to do it. And here's what could happen to us. God does test people. You got to admit that. God may let some things happen to see if we will get discouraged and quit and give up on our belief in God. Don't let it happen. That's what Satan wants. Satan is saying, yes, I want to discourage as many people as I can. People are probably discouraged about voting, discouraged about American democracy. I do understand it, but that's what Satan wants. Do not get discouraged. I'm not saying I know what God is doing and when, whatever he's going to do, I actually don't know. But don't forsake God's way. Don't lose your trust in God. Don't get overly discouraged. Don't give up. That's what the devil wants you to do. And then 1 Samuel 13:13, and Samuel said to Saul, this is the priest Samuel talking to Saul, you've done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart to be commander over his people. You know who that man was, of course, David. Here's what we think might have happened. God had finally said, Saul actually built a monument to himself, too. It's in that same period in the scriptures. God said, no, this guy's no longer humble. He finds excuses to disobey. He's willing to take over the high priest role. He's out. I got to look for his replacement. And there was this young shepherd, probably at night, guarding his sheep, probably 15 to 18 years old with his little lyre, writing music to God and some great prayers such as, when I see the heavens, what is man that you're mindful of me? I mean, what is man that God is mindful of us minuscule people? And David didn't even know the half of it. We know a lot more about space, and it's even bigger and more comprehensive. And it appears from our telescopes to be endless. I'm not saying it's endless, but that's how it looks. I can't see the end of it, and it's expanding at an accelerating pace. Whoa, David didn't even know the half of it. But when God saw the stars, when David saw the stars, David saw God. And God saw David, a man who really loved God with his heart. And he put it in his music. And instead of picking a guy 30 and 40 with a lot of political experience, God picked a man after his own heart, David, to be the king at that point. But what's interesting thing is, David didn't get to go to the throne anytime quickly. He got to go and be around Saul's throne doing music to soothe him when the evil spirits tormented him. So he got to learn a little about how royal courts work. And he got to be a national hero, but he didn't get to be king for a number of years. You're going to say, well, why did God do that? I'm not sure of all the reasons. You always find more as you study it. But can you see in the long game, God saw that it would make David stronger and his military force stronger and tougher. Those guys that were with David, they call him the mighty man. those guys did all kinds of military things. In those years of running from Saul's army, David and his men became a tough, disciplined force, and David got stronger spiritually and very determined. And one of the things that David did that might surprise you, twice God put him in a position to kill Saul. He even had his own men urging him. They said, well, if you don't want to do it, let me do it. His men were good soldiers. One stroke, I'll kill him. He'll be dead. He's trying to kill you. And David, you knew that was a test from God. And David said, no, it's up to God to remove him, not me. And we'll wait. And of course, God did at the right time. But he had to wait a number of years and dance around. It was called like a Robin Hood, escaping from the established king and his big army. But I can see where that made David stronger and better. And he had to learn to trust God. Like at one point, it's kind of interesting. Saul's army had been tipped off by, there was always people who for reward will spy on you. Where David was hiding, and Saul's army was circling, split up, was going to circle, and David was on the other side in a cave. And it's clear that if that army had kept circling, they would have soon cut David off. At that very moment, David was praying, the Philistines attacked. Saul had to leave to go fight the Philistines. I believe that if he knew for certain that David was where they thought he was, he would have said, let the Philistines rampage for a couple weeks. I got to get David. But he wasn't sure because David had escaped from his hand so many times he learned, I can't trust it. But can you see that God was with David? No matter what happened, it always eventually came out for David. Even Saul could see it. God is with David. He could feel it. He could see it. That only made his jealousy worse. But the question is, why did he make him wait so long? It was good for him. If evil wins and steals this election, I don't see a silver lining. I'm admitting, I do not see a silver lining. I see a bad lining. But remember, our vision is limited. God is in control. Do not get discouraged. Keep praying for America and keep praying for God's church.